The champagne glass slipped from my fingers when I heard my son Norman tell his business partners, "Oh, don't mind her, she's just the hired help. My mother likes to play hostess, but she's really nobody important," standing there in my own dining room. Wearing the Chanel suit I'd bought to celebrate his promotion, I watched 40 years of motherhood crumble into something unrecognizable. What Norman didn't know, what none of those smirking executives in their expensive suits knew as they chuckled at his casual cruelty, was that I wasn't just hosting this dinner party in my home, I was hosting it as the majority shareholder and silent partner of Henderson and Associates, the very consulting firm that employed every single person laughing at his joke. Now let me tell you how a woman gets to this moment, standing in her own home being dismissed as hired help by the son she'd spent decades building into a success story, and how sometimes the person you underestimate the most turns out to hold all the power you thought was yours. My name is Victoria Henderson, and if you saw me on the street, you'd probably assume I was just another well-dressed widow living comfortably off her late husband's modest life insurance policy. At 64, I've perfected the art of looking exactly like what people expect to see. Silver hair always perfectly styled, a wardrobe that whispers good taste rather than shouting serious money, and the kind of understated elegance that makes people comfortable rather than threatened. What they can't see, what I've deliberately hidden for 15 years, is that Victoria Henderson is also VH Holdings, the investment firm that quietly owns controlling interests in dozens of businesses throughout the Midwest, including the consulting firm where my son built his career believing every success was his own achievement. The decision to hide my wealth wasn't born from shame or modesty. It was strategic, the way most of my life decisions have been since Aaron died, and left me to figure out how to turn a comfortable insurance settlement into something that could support the kind of life I'd grown accustomed to living. Aaron had been a good husband and a decent provider, but he'd also been the kind of man who handled all the finances while expecting me to handle everything else. When the heart attack took him at 57, I inherited not just his life insurance policy, but also the sudden terrifying responsibility of managing money I'd never been allowed to touch. Enough to maintain our lifestyle if I was careful, but not enough to feel truly secure. The lawyer spoke to me in that particular tone men use when they're explaining finances to widows, patient but condescending, as if my grief had somehow impaired my ability to understand basic mathematics. "You'll want to put most of this in safe investments," he'd said, sliding papers across his desk for me to sign. "CDs, government bonds, maybe some blue-chip stocks. Nothing risky. The goal is preservation of capital, not growth." I signed where he pointed, nodded at his advice, and walked out of his office knowing I had no intention of following a single word of it. Not because I was reckless, but because I'd spent 25 years married to a man in corporate finance, and I'd been paying attention even when everyone assumed I was just playing the role of supportive wife. I'd listened to Aaron's phone calls with clients, read the financial reports he brought home, attended enough dinner parties with banking executives to understand that the conservative approach the lawyer was recommending was designed to keep me from losing money, not to help me build the kind of security that would let me sleep soundly for the rest of my life. So I took that insurance money and I started learning. Not the way women were supposed to learn about investing in 1995 through their husbands or male financial advisors, but by reading everything I could get my hands on, attending investment seminars where I was often the only woman under 70, and most importantly, by starting small and paying attention to what worked. I bought individual stocks in companies I understood, small real estate investments in neighborhoods I researched carefully, and municipal bonds that provided steady income while I figured out what I was doing. The first year I made cautious moves and modest profits. The second year I got bolder and made better returns. By the third year, I discovered I had something my late husband had never possessed: an intuitive understanding of people and businesses that translated surprisingly well to investment decisions. I could read an annual report and sense the management problems that wouldn't show up in the numbers for another 6 months. I could visit a neighborhood and know which way property values were trending before the real estate agents figured it out. I could sit in a restaurant and predict whether the chain was going to expand successfully based on how they treated their employees and managed their operations. What started as careful stock picks grew into systematic investment strategies. Real estate ventures that began with a single duplex expanded into apartment buildings and commercial properties. Stock investments evolved into taking meaningful positions in undervalued companies where I could actually influence management decisions. By the time Norman graduated from college 8 years after Aaron's death, I was quietly managing a portfolio worth several $1 million, but everyone around me still saw the modest widow who drove a 5-year-old car and shopped for clothes at department store sales. The secrecy hadn't been intentional at first. I was just a woman learning to manage money in a world that didn't expect women to be good at it, and I'd quickly discovered that being underestimated was actually an advantage. Male executives would share information in front of me that they'd never reveal to someone they perceived as a serious investor. Business owners would speak candidly about their challenges and opportunities when they thought I was just a widow with a small inheritance to invest. Real estate developers would show me properties and discuss their plans with the kind of openness they reserved for people they didn't consider real competition. But by the time I realized how much my financial situation had changed, Norman was struggling with his own career challenges, and I made the decision that would shape our relationship for the next decade. My son was 26, drowning in student loan debt despite the partial scholarships that had gotten him through business school, and working for a small consulting firm that paid him barely enough to cover his rent in a decent neighborhood. He was smart and ambitious and hardworking, but he was also competing against young men whose families had connections and resources he couldn't match. I could have simply written him a check to pay off his loans and help him get established. I could have told him about my business success and offered to help him understand investing and wealth management. I could have introduced him to the network of professionals I'd been building relationships with for years. Instead, I made the choice that seemed loving and wise at the time. I decided to help him build his own success story without knowing about my involvement, to let him develop genuine confidence in his abilities rather than becoming dependent on his mother's money. So when Norman mentioned that Henderson and Associates was looking for someone with his background, I quietly made inquiries about the firm. When I learned they were well-managed but undercapitalized, I arranged to meet with their senior partners about investment opportunities. When they proved to be as competent and ambitious as I'd hoped, I acquired a significant stake in the company. 47%, enough to have real influence over strategic decisions without having to take operational control. And when Norman applied for a position there 6 months later, I made sure his application received serious consideration, but I also made sure he was qualified for the job he eventually got. For 10 years, I'd been the invisible hand guiding Norman's career, while he attributed every success to his own merit. The promotion to account manager that came just 6 months after he was hired? I'd recommended creating that position after reviewing the company's client retention statistics and suggesting they needed someone with Norman's analytical skills focused specifically on maintaining strategic relationships. The assignment to the Miller Industries account that made his reputation? I'd identified that client as likely to become a major revenue source and suggested Norman was the right person to handle their expansion needs. The corner office, the salary increases, the gradual movement into senior management, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by someone who wanted to see him succeed, but also wanted him to believe he'd earned every opportunity himself. The irony was that Norman really had earned it. I'd opened doors, but he'd walked through them with competence and professionalism that justified every advancement. I'd created opportunities, but he'd seized them with the kind of strategic thinking and client relationship skills that proved he belonged in senior management. Everything I'd arranged for him could have backfired spectacularly if he hadn't been genuinely good at his job. The fact that he succeeded so completely should have been evidence of his real capabilities, but somewhere along the way, success had transformed my sweet, ambitious son into someone I barely recognized. The change had been gradual enough that I'd missed it until it was too late to address easily. The boy who used to call me every Sunday to tell me about his week became a man who called when he needed something. The young professional who'd valued my advice about office politics became an executive who assumed my insights came from watching too much television rather than from actual business experience. The son who'd once introduced me proudly as my mother, who's the smartest person I know, became someone who presented me to his colleagues as a pleasant but essentially irrelevant domestic presence in his increasingly important life. But it was the dinner party that finally forced me to confront how completely our relationship had shifted, and how much responsibility I bore for creating the dynamic that was destroying it. Norman had called on a Tuesday afternoon in September, using the tone I'd learned to recognize as his professional voice bleeding into our personal conversations. Not the warm familiarity of a son calling his mother, but the efficient courtesy of an executive delegating tasks to competent support staff. "Mother, I need you to put together one of your dinner parties," he'd said without preamble, as if my carefully planned entertaining was some quaint hobby rather than events that had impressed CEOs and politicians during my years as Aaron's wife. Nothing too elaborate, just something that will make the right impression on my colleagues. I'm up for another promotion, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, and it would help if the Henderson and Associates executive team could see that I come from good stock. Good stock. As if I were livestock being evaluated for breeding potential rather than a human being who'd raised him with more love and sacrifice than he'd apparently bothered to remember. "Of course, dear," I'd said, because some maternal instincts die harder than others, and because I still hoped that underneath the executive persona, my son retained some capacity for recognizing the people who'd helped him become successful. "When were you thinking?" "Friday evening. I know it's short notice, but they've just announced the position internally, and I want to move quickly to establish myself as the obvious choice. James Pence will be there. He's the managing partner, along with Sarah Martinez from International Development and David Thompson from Financial Analysis. Maybe a couple of the junior associates too. 7 people total." I'd spent the next 3 days planning a menu that would showcase exactly the kind of understated sophistication that Aaron had taught me was appropriate for serious business entertaining. Nothing flashy or obviously expensive, but everything executed with the kind of attention to detail that suggested both good taste and adequate resources. Herb-crusted lamb with red wine reduction, roasted vegetables from the farmer's market, and a chocolate soufflé that would require precise timing but would demonstrate the kind of culinary skill that impressed people who ate well regularly. I'd even bought a new outfit for the occasion, a navy Chanel suit with pearl buttons that cost more than most people's monthly salary, though Norman had never asked where a widow's supposedly modest budget stretched to such things. I paired it with the strand of Mikomoto pearls Aaron had given me for our 20th anniversary, and the diamond earrings I bought myself last Christmas with dividends from a particularly successful technology investment. I wanted to look like a mother he could be proud of, a woman whose presence would enhance rather than detract from his professional image. The evening started well enough. Norman arrived precisely at 7 with 5 colleagues from Henderson and Associates, each dressed in the kind of expensive suits that suggested both serious money and serious ambition. James Pence, the managing partner I'd specifically recommended for promotion 3 years earlier, after being impressed with his innovative approach to international consulting. Sarah Martinez, whose proposals for expanding their European operations had been so well researched and strategically sound that I'd personally approved the budget increases needed to implement them. David Thompson, the financial analyst whose quarterly reports demonstrated exactly the kind of careful thinking I valued in business partnerships. Norman introduced me to each of them with polite but perfunctory warmth, identifying me simply as my mother Victoria, without any particular indication that I might be more than an aging relative fulfilling hostess duties. I smiled graciously, offered drinks, and retreated to the kitchen to attend to dinner, playing the role he'd assigned me with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent 25 years being simultaneously visible and invisible at corporate gatherings. But as the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues around my dining room table, I began to hear myself discussed in terms that made my blood pressure spike in ways my doctor would have found alarming. Norman spoke about me as if I were a convenient prop in his life story, the widowed mother who provided home-cooked meals and a respectable address for entertaining, but who otherwise existed somewhere in the background of his important career. When James Pence complimented the meal and asked politely about my background, Norman actually laughed before answering. "Oh, Mother's always been good at playing house," he said with the kind of indulgent tone you might use to describe a child's imaginary tea party. "She doesn't really understand business, but she knows how to throw a decent dinner party. Dad's insurance money keeps her comfortable enough, and she likes to pretend she understands the market by reading the financial pages, but really she's just good at the domestic stuff." Playing house. As if 15 years of careful investment decisions, strategic business relationships, and financial analysis that had built a multimillion-dollar portfolio were somehow equivalent to arranging flowers and folding napkins. As if the business insights I'd been developing through actual experience were just the amusing delusions of a woman with too much time on her hands. The conversation continued around me as if I were indeed invisible, these executives discussing quarterly projections and strategic initiatives for a company I own nearly half of, debating personnel decisions I'd already approved or rejected in private meetings with senior management. They talked enthusiastically about the recent expansion into European markets, a move I'd personally advocated for, and funded through a capital injection disguised as a new round of investment from V.H. Holdings. They analyzed the upcoming acquisition of a smaller firm in Phoenix, a deal I'd been monitoring closely for 8 months, including reviewing their financial statements and management structure, before giving my approval for Henderson and Associates to proceed. They discussed the company's financial health with the kind of detailed knowledge that impressed them as corporate insiders, never suspecting that the woman refilling their wine glasses received more comprehensive financial reports than any of them, including detailed breakdowns of every department's performance, complete analyses of client retention and acquisition costs, and strategic projections that went out 5 years rather than the quarterly focus that dominated their day-to-day thinking. But it was the moment with the champagne glass that crystallized 15 years of accumulated resentment into something approaching cold fury. We'd moved to the living room for after-dinner drinks, and I'd been serving Dom Perignon from the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion, which I'd naively assumed meant celebrating my son's continued success rather than watching him perform casual cruelty for the entertainment of colleagues whose salaries I ultimately determined. Sarah Martinez had been genuinely lovely all evening, asking thoughtful questions about the artwork on my walls, and expressing real interest in the antique furniture I'd collected over the years. She was clearly someone with both intelligence and emotional awareness, which explained why I'd been so impressed with her strategic proposals that I'd pushed for her rapid advancement within the company. She just asked if I'd ever worked outside the home, a perfectly reasonable question that suggested actual curiosity about my life rather than polite small talk. Before I could answer, Norman jumped in with that particular tone I'd grown to despise, the one that suggested he was sharing an amusing anecdote rather than discussing his mother's actual life and capabilities. "Sarah, don't encourage her," he'd said with the kind of indulgent smile you might give a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. "Mother's never had to work a day in her life. Dad's insurance money keeps her comfortable enough, and she likes to pretend she understands business by reading the Wall Street Journal, but really she's just the hired help around here. Good at keeping house and cooking meals, but let's not pretend she has any idea what we're talking about when it comes to real business. Just the hired help." The champagne glass slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. Every conversation stopped, every face turned toward me, and I saw reflected in their expressions the kind of second-hand embarrassment people feel when witnessing someone being publicly diminished by someone who should love and protect them. James Pence looked genuinely uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Norman and me as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just heard. Sarah Martinez appeared almost angry on my behalf, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested she was processing Norman's words and finding them completely unacceptable. Even the junior associates seemed to recognize that something inappropriate had just happened, that they'd witnessed a level of casual cruelty that reflected poorly on everyone present. But Norman just kept smiling that indulgent smile, apparently pleased with his performance, completely unaware that he'd just humiliated the person who'd been quietly orchestrating his career advancement for the past decade. He even made some joke about getting the maid to clean that up, while I stood there, pieces of crystal scattered around my feet like fragments of every assumption I'd made about our relationship. That's when I excused myself to get a broom, and that's when I made the decision that would change everything. Standing in my kitchen with my hands shaking from rage and heartbreak, I pulled out my phone and called my assistant Jennifer at her home number. Jennifer Mason had been my right hand for 8 years, managing the intricate details of my business investments with the kind of discretion that made her worth every penny of her 6-figure salary. She'd signed confidentiality agreements that rivaled those of Fortune 500 companies, and she'd earned my trust by never once revealing the scope of my business activities to anyone, including my son. "Mrs. Henderson?" Jennifer's voice was immediately alert despite the late hour. "Is everything all right? Jennifer, I need you to prepare a very specific set of documents for tomorrow morning," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the tremor in my hands. "I want a complete portfolio breakdown of V.H. Holdings delivered to Henderson and Associates first thing tomorrow, along with documentation of every investment decision I've made regarding the company for the past 5 years. Include the personnel recommendations, the budget approvals, the strategic initiatives I've funded. Everything." There was a pause, and I could practically hear Jennifer's mind working through the implications. She'd been waiting for this day, I realized. She'd watched me facilitate Norman's career from the shadows for years, and she'd probably been wondering when I'd finally assert my actual authority rather than continuing to hide behind anonymous investment entities. Should I include the documentation of your specific requests regarding Norman Henderson's promotions and assignments? She asked carefully. Include everything, I said. Every recommendation I made for his advancement, every budget increase I approved to create positions for him, every strategic move I made to ensure his success. I want them to understand exactly who the hired help really is. I'll have everything ready by 8 a.m., Jennifer said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Should I schedule a meeting with their executive team? Schedule it for 10 a.m., I said. Give them time to review the documents first. I want them to understand the full scope of what they're looking at before I walk into that conference room. I hung up the phone and took several deep breaths, trying to process what I just set in motion. In 12 hours, Norman would discover that his mother wasn't just the woman who'd raised him and cooked his favorite meals. She was his employer's business partner, a woman whose investment decisions affected every aspect of his professional life, and whose strategic input shaped the very opportunities he'd been so proud of earning through his own merit. But first, I had to finish playing hostess to the colleagues who just witnessed him dismiss me as irrelevant domestic help. I returned to the living room with a small broom and dustpan, quietly cleaning up the shattered champagne glass while conversation resumed around me. But something had shifted in the room's dynamic, I noticed. Sarah Martinez was asking Norman pointed questions about his background and experience, her tone noticeably cooler than it had been earlier in the evening. James Pence was studying me with curious eyes, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't previously noticed. Even the junior associates seemed to be paying more attention to my responses when directly addressed, perhaps recognizing that Norman's dismissal of me had been inappropriately harsh even by corporate standards. The rest of the evening passed in a sort of surreal haze. I served coffee and cognac, participated in conversation when addressed directly, and played the role of gracious hostess while internally counting down the hours until tomorrow's revelation. Norman continued to treat me with casual dismissiveness, making little jokes about my domestic skills and my supposed lack of understanding about real business, apparently oblivious to the increasingly uncomfortable glances his colleagues were exchanging every time he diminished me. When they finally left around 11 p.m., Norman lingered behind to help with dishes, which would have been a thoughtful gesture if he hadn't spent the evening treating me like hired help. We worked in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. I think that went really well, he said, loading wine glasses into the dishwasher with the careful precision of someone who'd had just slightly too much to drink. Sarah seemed impressed with the meal, and James was asking about the wine selection. You did good tonight, Mother. You did good. As if I were a pet who'd performed an amusing trick rather than a woman who'd spent 2 days planning and executing a sophisticated dinner party that had cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. I'm glad you were pleased, I said carefully, not trusting myself to say more without revealing the extent of my anger. The promotion should be announced next week, he continued, apparently taking my restraint for enthusiasm about his career prospects. Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, with a corner office and a substantial salary increase. I've worked really hard for this, and it's finally paying off. He'd worked hard. For a position I'd specifically requested the company create for him, funded by budget increases I'd personally approved during quarterly strategic planning sessions, he didn't even know I attended. I'm sure you have, I said, focusing on washing the crystal stemware by hand rather than looking at his face. You know, Mother, I really appreciate everything you've done for me over the years, he said, and for just a moment his voice carried a hint of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. The dinners like tonight, the advice when I was starting out, just being here when I needed family support. I know I don't say it often enough, but you've been a good mother. A good mother. Not a person worthy of respect, not someone whose intelligence or business achievements might have value in their own right, just a good mother. Someone who'd successfully performed the supporting role in his life story, without requiring acknowledgement, as an independent human being with her own ambitions and accomplishments. Thank you, Norman, I said, because what else could I say? Tomorrow would bring its own conversations, its own revelations, its own reckonings. Tonight, I was still playing the part he'd assigned me, still maintaining the fiction that had somehow become the entire foundation of our relationship. After he left, I sat in my living room nursing a final glass of wine and thinking about the conversation that would take place in less than 12 hours. Norman would walk into his office tomorrow morning expecting a normal day, perhaps looking forward to hearing about his promotion, certainly unaware that his mother had spent the evening orchestrating what amounted to the most comprehensive wake-up call of his adult life. The portfolio Jennifer would deliver wasn't just financial documentation. It was a complete map of every professional advantage I'd quietly provided over the past decade. The recommendation letter I'd written under V.H. Holdings' letterhead that had gotten him his first interview at Henderson & Associates. The strategic consultation I provided on the Miller Industries account that had made his reputation as a rising star in business development. The budget approvals I'd pushed through for technology upgrades that had made his department's productivity statistics look spectacular compared to industry standards. The personnel recommendations that had placed supportive colleagues around him, while quietly moving potential rivals to other divisions or different companies entirely. For 10 years I'd been the invisible hand guiding his career trajectory, the anonymous investor ensuring his success, the silent partner making certain that every opportunity he thought he'd earned through merit had actually been carefully orchestrated by someone who loved him enough to remain in the shadows while he built his confidence. And his response to a decade of secret support had been to dismiss me as hired help in front of colleagues, whose salaries I ultimately approved, and whose career advancement I influenced through my position on the company's strategic planning committee. I went to bed that night with a strange combination of anticipation and profound sadness. Anticipation for the conversation that would finally force Norman to see me as more than a convenient domestic accessory, who existed to facilitate his professional image. Sadness for the relationship that had somehow deteriorated to the point where such a dramatic revelation was necessary to restore basic respect and recognition of my worth as a human being. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of September day that made Chicago look like a postcard version of itself, all golden light and crisp air that promised autumn was coming but hadn't yet arrived. I dressed carefully in a black St. John suit that suggested serious business without being unnecessarily intimidating, paired with the pearl earrings Aaron had given me for our 15th anniversary, and the watch I'd bought myself after my first seven-figure investment return. Professional but not ostentatious, authoritative but not aggressive. The armor of a woman who'd learned to navigate corporate politics when it was still unusual for women to do so successfully. Jennifer called at 8:30 to confirm that the portfolio had been delivered to Henderson & Associates, and that the 10 a.m. meeting was confirmed with the executive team. She'd also, with her characteristic attention to detail, arranged for Norman to be invited to join the meeting without any explanation of why his presence was requested, ensuring that he'd be present for the full revelation without having time to prepare or rationalize what he was about to learn. "How are you feeling about this, Mrs. Henderson?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. She'd watched me navigate the complexities of secret investment management for years, and she understood better than anyone how carefully I protected Norman from knowledge of my involvement in his career. "Like I should have done this years ago," I said honestly, "and like I wish it wasn't necessary at all." "He's going to be shocked," she said carefully. "He's going to be furious," I corrected. "At least initially. Norman doesn't like discovering that his assumptions about the world are wrong, and this is going to challenge every assumption he's made about his own success and my role in his life." I arrived at Henderson & Associates at 9:45, walking through the lobby of the building I'd visited dozens of times for investor meetings but never as Norman's mother. The receptionist recognized me and smiled politely, probably assuming I was there for another one of my quarterly consultations with the managing partners. She had no way of knowing that today's meeting would reveal exactly why those quarterly consultations had always seemed to carry unusual weight in company decision-making. The conference room on the 40th floor offered spectacular views of Lake Michigan, and the executive team was already assembled when I arrived. James Pence stood to greet me with a handshake that seemed more respectful than it had the night before, as if he'd spent the morning thinking about our dinner conversation and reaching different conclusions about my role in the evening's dynamics. Sarah Martinez smiled warmly, and I noticed she was holding a folder that undoubtedly contained the documentation Jennifer had delivered. Mrs. Henderson, James said formally, thank you for coming in this morning. I think we have some very important things to discuss. Norman arrived exactly at 10, looking slightly puzzled but not particularly concerned. He was wearing his best suit and the tie I'd given him for Christmas, clearly expecting something positive rather than life-changing. When he saw me sitting at the conference table with the company's senior executives, his expression shifted to mild confusion. Mother? What are you doing here? He asked, taking the seat across from me with the kind of indulgent smile that suggested he thought I might have gotten confused about something or perhaps needed help with some minor financial matter. Norman, James began carefully, we asked your mother to join us this morning because we've received some information that puts last night's dinner conversation in a very different context. I'm not sure I understand, Norman said, looking between me and the assembled executives with growing confusion. Sarah Martinez opened her folder and removed a document I recognized as the summary sheet Jennifer prepared for all my major investments. Norman, were you aware that your mother is the majority shareholder of V.H. Holdings, the investment firm that owns 47% of Henderson and Associates? The color drained from Norman's face so quickly I was momentarily concerned about his blood pressure. He stared at the document Sarah had placed in front of him, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A combination of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror as the implications began to register in his mind. I don't understand, he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mother, what is this? What are they talking about? They're talking about the fact that I've been your business partner for the past 5 years, I said calmly, and your career facilitator for the past 10. Every promotion you've received, every opportunity that's come your way, every strategic advantage you've attributed to your own merit. I've been the one making sure those things happened. James Pence placed another document on the table, this one containing copies of my personnel recommendations written on V.H. Holdings letterhead. Your mother specifically requested that we create the senior vice president position you're about to be promoted to. She also recommended your initial hiring, your first promotion, and your assignment to every major account that's advanced your reputation within the company. Norman picked up the document with shaking hands, reading his own name and recommendations I'd written describing his qualifications and potential. His face cycled through several colors before settling on a pale green that suggested nausea. But why? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to build genuine confidence, I said quietly. I wanted you to believe in your own abilities to develop real skills, to become the kind of man who could succeed on his own merit. I thought that if you knew I was facilitating your opportunities, you might become dependent rather than driven to excel. But you let me think, he started then stopped, apparently unable to finish the sentence. I let you think you'd achieved everything yourself, I finished for him. And you did achieve it, Norman. I opened doors but you had to walk through them. I created opportunities but you had to prove you deserved them. Everything you've accomplished required real skill and real effort on your part. Sarah Martinez spoke up gently. The strategic analysis you did on the Miller Industries account was genuinely impressive. Your proposals for the international expansion were innovative and well-researched. Your mother may have facilitated the opportunities, but the work was entirely your own. But Norman wasn't ready to hear about his genuine achievements. He was still processing the magnitude of what he'd just learned, and I could see the exact moment when the full implications hit him. His behavior the night before, the casual dismissal, the hired help comment, the complete disregard for my intelligence or worth, all of it suddenly took on a completely different meaning when viewed through the lens of actual power dynamics and business relationships. Oh God, he said, putting his head in his hands. Last night, the things I said, the way I talked about you in front of. He looked up at the executives around the table, all of whom had witnessed his performance. They all heard me dismiss you as irrelevant. They did, I confirmed. And so did I. The conference room fell silent except for the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Norman sat with his head in his hands, and I watched him grapple with a reality that challenged everything he believed about his own life and achievements. The successful executive who'd built his career on merit was discovering that his mother had been the architect of his professional trajectory. The confident man who'd treated her as hired help was learning that she was actually his employer's business partner and strategic advisor. Finally, he looked up with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he was fighting back tears. "How long have you been doing this? The investments, the recommendations, all of it." "The investment started 15 years ago, just after your father died," I said. "Small at first, but they grew quickly once I learned what I was doing. The involvement with Henderson and Associates began when you graduated college and were looking for your first position. I researched companies that might be good career foundations for someone with your interests and skills, and this firm impressed me enough that I decided to make it a significant investment. You bought into the company to help me get a job." "I bought into the company because it was a sound investment with good leadership and strong growth potential," I corrected. "The fact that it also provided opportunities for your career was a bonus, not the primary motivation." James Pence leaned forward, clearly fascinated by this revelation. "Mrs. Henderson, can you help us understand the scope of your business involvement? The documents your assistant delivered this morning suggest a much more extensive investment portfolio than we'd realized." For the next hour, I walked them through 15 years of carefully managed investments, strategic acquisitions, and business partnerships that had grown from Aaron's modest life insurance policy into something approaching serious wealth. I explained how I'd identified undervalued companies with strong leadership, how I provided capital for expansions and acquisitions, how I'd built relationships with executives across multiple industries who trusted my judgment and sought my advice on strategic planning. I showed them the portfolio that included manufacturing companies, technology startups, real estate developments, and consulting firms across the Midwest and beyond. I described the decision-making process behind major investments, the research I conducted before committing capital, and the ongoing strategic input I provided to companies where I held significant positions. Norman listened to this recital with growing amazement and what I was beginning to recognize as genuine respect. The woman he'd dismissed as someone who played house was revealing herself as an investor whose business acumen had built and sustained the very success he'd been so proud of achieving. The mother he'd patronized as someone who didn't understand real business had been conducting real business at a level that dwarfed his own professional responsibilities. "But Mother," he said when I'd finished the overview, "this is incredible. You've built something amazing. Why keep it secret? Why hide this level of success?" "Because I wanted you to respect me for who I was, not what I owned," I said simply. "I wanted you to value my intelligence and my insights because they had merit, not because they came with financial leverage. I wanted our relationship to be built on love and mutual respect, not on power dynamics and economic dependence." The irony of that statement hung in the air like smoke. I'd hidden my financial power to avoid corrupting our relationship with economic dynamics, but my son had ended up treating me with casual disrespect anyway, apparently because he'd assumed I had no power worth acknowledging at all. Sarah Martinez asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. "Mrs. Henderson, what happens now? Do you plan to change your level of involvement with the company? Will this affect Norman's position here?" I'd been thinking about this question since the moment I'd made the phone call to Jennifer the night before. The revelation was only the beginning. Now I had to decide what kind of relationship I wanted with both the company and my son going forward. "Nothing changes regarding Norman's employment," I said firmly. "His promotions and opportunities have been based on genuine merit, even if I facilitated the initial access. He's earned his position through his own efforts, and he should keep it based on his own performance." Norman looked up sharply. "But what about us? What about our relationship? How do we move forward from this?" That was the real question, wasn't it? How do you rebuild a relationship after discovering that all your assumptions about power, respect, and value were fundamentally wrong? How do you continue loving someone who's revealed that they saw you as essentially worthless until forced to confront evidence to the contrary? "I think that depends on whether you can learn to see me differently," I said carefully. "For 10 years I've been supporting your career from the shadows because I believed in your potential and wanted you to succeed. But last night you made it clear that you see me as nothing more than domestic help, someone whose opinions don't matter, and whose contributions have no value. If that's genuinely how you see me, then I'm not sure what kind of relationship we can have going forward." "That's not how I see you," Norman said quickly, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. It's exactly how you see me, I replied. And more importantly, it's how you presented me to your colleagues. You didn't just dismiss my contributions, you actively diminished me in front of people whose respect I value. You made me invisible in my own home while entertaining guests at my own table. The truth of that statement settled over the conference room like a weight. Everyone present had witnessed the dynamic I was describing, and no one could deny that Norman had treated me with casual cruelty rather than respect. James Pence cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this is a conversation that would be better continued privately. Actually, I said, I think it's important for Norman's colleagues to understand the full situation. They're going to be working with him knowing what they now know about our relationship, and they deserve to understand that his behavior last night doesn't reflect the values of this company, or the kind of professional environment you're trying to maintain here. I turned to address Norman directly. Your colleagues watched you humiliate someone you assumed had no power to defend herself. They saw you dismiss and diminish someone you thought was irrelevant to your success. That reflects on your character and your judgment, and it affects how they're going to view your leadership potential going forward. The weight of that observation was clearly hitting Norman as he looked around the table at colleagues who were now seeing him in a very different light. The confident executive who'd seemed destined for continued advancement was being forced to confront the possibility that his own behavior might limit his future opportunities. I need to apologize, he said finally, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine remorse, to all of you for what you witnessed last night. And to you, Mother, for he trailed off, apparently unable to find words adequate to describe the scope of what he needed to apologize for. For treating me like hired help? I suggested. For dismissing 40 years of motherhood as irrelevant domestic service? For making jokes about my intelligence in front of people whose careers I could end with a phone call? Each phrase hit him like a physical blow, and I watched him fully comprehend for the first time exactly how his behavior had looked from my perspective. The casual cruelty that had seemed like harmless joking the night before was revealed as something much uglier when viewed through the lens of actual power dynamics. How do I fix this? He asked, and for the first time since he'd walked into the conference room, he sounded like the boy I'd raised rather than the arrogant man he'd become. You start by acknowledging that you can't fix it with an apology, I said. You've spent years treating me as if my thoughts and opinions don't matter, as if my only value is in providing domestic services and emotional support. Last night was just the most public example of an attitude that's been developing for a long time. I stood up, gathering my purse and the portfolio materials Jennifer had prepared. I'm going to give you some time to think about what kind of relationship you want us to have going forward. But I want you to understand that the old dynamic, where I support your career from the shadows while you treat me as irrelevant, is over. If you want me in your life, it will be as someone you respect, not someone you tolerate. As I walked toward the conference room door, Sarah Martinez spoke up. Mrs. Henderson, will you continue your involvement with the company? For now, I said. I believe in what Henderson and Associates is building, and I think the company has a strong future. But I'll be taking a more visible role in strategic planning going forward. The days of anonymous influence are over. I paused at the door and looked back at Norman, who was sitting frozen in his chair, still processing everything he'd learned. Son, I love you more than you can possibly imagine. I've spent 10 years trying to give you every advantage I could while letting you believe you'd earned it all yourself. But I won't spend another 10 years being treated as if I'm invisible in my own life. The elevator ride down to the lobby gave me 40 floors to process what had just happened. In the space of 1 hour, I'd dismantled the careful fiction I'd maintained for a decade, revealed the true scope of my business success, and forced my son to confront his own assumptions about merit, achievement, and respect. The relief I felt was almost overwhelming. No more hiding my intelligence, no more pretending my insights came from casual newspaper reading rather than detailed market analysis. No more accepting dismissive treatment from someone whose career I'd been orchestrating from behind the scenes. But beneath the relief was a deeper sadness for the relationship that had somehow deteriorated to the point where such a dramatic revelation was necessary. I'd raised Norman to be confident and successful, but somewhere along the way, I'd failed to teach him that confidence shouldn't come at the expense of treating others, especially family members, with basic respect and dignity. My phone rang before I'd even reached my car, and I saw Norman's name on the display. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for the conversation that call would inevitably bring. The message he left was brief and heartbreaking. "Mother, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Please call me back. I love you and I need to make this right." But making it right would require more than apologies and good intentions. It would require Norman to fundamentally change how he saw me, and how he treated me, and how he valued my contributions to his life. It would require me to find a way to be generous with my love, while setting boundaries that protected my dignity. It would require both of us to build something new from the ruins of assumptions that had proven inadequate to sustain the relationship we both wanted to have. That afternoon, I called Jennifer and asked her to prepare a comprehensive transition plan for my business investments. If I was going to take a more visible role in the companies I'd been supporting from the shadows, I needed to establish clear protocols for direct communication, regular reporting, and strategic consultation. The days of anonymous influence were over, as I told Sarah Martinez, and that meant developing new frameworks for exercising the authority I'd been wielding invisibly for years. "I want board positions," I told Jennifer as we reviewed my portfolio in my home office, surrounded by 15 years of carefully organized investment files. "Not just voting shares and quarterly reports. I want to be in the room where decisions are made, and I want my expertise recognized for what it is rather than filtered through anonymous investment entities." Jennifer nodded approvingly. She'd been watching me navigate the complexities of hidden influence for years, and I could see the relief in her expression as we discussed bringing my business activities into the open. "The Henderson and Associates situation was inevitable," she said carefully. "You couldn't support Norman's career indefinitely without him eventually discovering your involvement. Better that it happened on your terms rather than through some accidental revelation." Over the next several weeks, I systematically emerged from the shadows of my own business empire. Board meetings that had previously received my input through carefully worded memos from V.H. Holdings suddenly found Victoria Henderson herself sitting at conference tables, asking pointed questions about strategic initiatives and offering insights drawn from decades of cross-industry experience. The reaction was universally positive. These were intelligent people who recognized competence when they saw it, and my transition from anonymous investor to active partner proceeded with remarkable smoothness. The transformation wasn't just professional. It was personal in ways I hadn't anticipated. For years, I'd been living a double life, compartmentalizing my business acumen from my role as Norman's mother, hiding my intelligence behind the comfortable fiction of the widowed housewife with good instincts about money. Stepping into the light, claiming my actual identity as a successful businesswoman, felt like putting on clothes that finally fit properly after years of wearing costumes that never quite suited me. Norman, meanwhile, was struggling with his own transformation. The confident executive who dismissed me as hired help was having to reconstruct his entire understanding of our relationship, and the process was evidently more difficult than he'd anticipated. He called several times during those first weeks, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from formal apologies to rambling confessions about his behavior over the years. I listened to each message but didn't return his calls immediately, needing time to process my own feelings before engaging with his guilt and confusion. But I also spent those weeks thinking about the patterns that had brought us to this point. Norman's behavior hadn't developed overnight. It had been years in the making, a gradual erosion of respect that I'd enabled by accepting smaller slights while hoping he'd eventually mature into someone who valued my contributions. Every time I'd let a dismissive comment pass without challenge, every time I'd allowed him to treat me as if my insights were lucky guesses rather than informed analysis, I'd been teaching him that such treatment was acceptable. The responsibility wasn't entirely his. I'd created the dynamic by hiding my expertise, by playing the role of the modest widow who just happened to have good instincts about investments. I'd wanted to protect his confidence, but in doing so, I'd made it impossible for him to see me as a complete person worthy of respect. The fiction I'd maintained for his benefit had become a prison for both of us. The conversation we finally had took place 3 weeks after the revelation, in my living room on a Sunday afternoon when he showed up unannounced and refused to leave until I agreed to talk. He looked terrible, thinner than I'd seen him in years, with dark circles under his eyes and the kind of rumpled appearance that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "I've been thinking about everything," he said without preamble, sitting heavily in the armchair across from where I was reading the Sunday financial pages. "Not just what happened at dinner, but years of conversations, years of interactions. I've been going through my memories and seeing them differently, and I don't like what I'm discovering about myself." I folded the newspaper and gave him my full attention, recognizing that this was a conversation we'd been needing to have for longer than either of us had realized. "I remember when I got my first promotion," he continued. "How proud I was, how sure I was that I'd earned it through my own merit. And you were so supportive, so encouraging, asking all the right questions about my new responsibilities and celebrating my success. I thought you were just being a good mother, taking pleasure in your son's achievements." "I was being a good mother," I said quietly. "Everything I did was motivated by love for you and belief in your potential. But I never asked how you knew which questions to ask," he said, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine remorse. "I never wondered why your advice about office politics was always so sophisticated, or how you understood company dynamics when you'd supposedly never worked in corporate environments. I just assumed you were naturally intuitive about these things, without ever considering that your insights might come from actual experience and expertise." This was the heart of it, I realized. Not just the casual cruelty of the hired help comment, but years of assumptions that had allowed him to dismiss my intelligence as lucky guesswork rather than recognizing it as the product of serious business experience. "You assumed I was naturally gifted at supporting your career," I said, without ever considering that I might have a career of my own worth supporting. He flinched at that observation but didn't contradict it. "I've been talking to Sarah Martinez," he said after a moment. "She's been helping me understand how what I said that night looked from everyone else's perspective. She said watching me dismiss you was like watching someone insult their mentor without realizing who they were talking to." "Sarah is a wise woman," I said. "I've been impressed with her strategic thinking since she joined the company." "You recommended her hiring," Norman said, and it wasn't a question. "Along with James Pence's promotion to managing partner, and David Thompson's transfer to the financial analysis division. You've been orchestrating the personnel decisions that shaped my entire professional environment." "I've been advocating for competent people who I thought would create a positive working environment," I corrected. "I wanted you surrounded by colleagues who would challenge you to grow and support you in developing real expertise. Instead of recognizing that you were the one doing the challenging and supporting," he said. "I thought it was just lucky that I happened to work with such exceptional people, never realizing that their presence in my professional life was deliberate rather than coincidental." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of this new understanding. Finally, Norman looked up with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child seeking forgiveness after some serious misbehavior. "How do I make this right?" he asked. "How do I apologize for years of treating you as if your only value was in providing domestic support? How do I acknowledge that I've been the beneficiary of your business expertise, while simultaneously dismissing that expertise as irrelevant?" "You start by stopping," I said simply. "No more jokes about my lack of business understanding. No more assumptions that my insights come from intuition rather than analysis. No more treating me as if I'm playing house when I'm actually managing a significant investment portfolio. And then you work on seeing me as a whole person," I said. "Someone who happens to be your mother, but who also has her own interests, her own expertise, her own accomplishments that exist independently of my relationship to you. You work on valuing my thoughts and opinions because they have merit, not because they come from someone who loves you." Over the following months, we began the slow work of rebuilding our relationship on more honest foundations. Norman started asking different kinds of questions about my business activities, showing genuine curiosity about my investment strategies, and seeking my advice on professional challenges with the respect he might show a valued mentor. I began sharing more details about my work, explaining the reasoning behind strategic decisions, and including him in conversations about industry trends and market analysis. The change wasn't just in how he treated me, but in how I allowed myself to be treated. No more self-deprecating jokes about my amateur understanding of finance. No more hiding my expertise behind modest disclaimers about luck and intuition. No more accepting the role of supportive audience to his professional achievements when I was actually a significant architect of the opportunities that made those achievements possible. But the real test came 6 months later, when Norman hosted another business dinner, this time a celebration of the European expansion that Sarah Martinez had been leading. The guest list included not just Henderson and Associates executives, but also representatives from the European partners and 2 potential clients who were considering major consulting contracts. "I'd like you to be there not just as my mother, but as a strategic advisor," Norman said when he called to invite me. "Sarah suggested that your perspective on international business development would be valuable for the conversations we're likely to have." The dinner itself was a revelation. Norman introduced me to every guest as my mother, Victoria Henderson, who's a major investor and strategic advisor with several companies in the region, including Henderson and Associates. When the European partners asked about my background, he spoke knowledgeably about my investment portfolio and business expertise, clearly proud rather than embarrassed by my accomplishments. During the strategic planning discussion that dominated the evening's conversation, Norman actively sought my input, asking specific questions about market entry strategies and capital allocation that demonstrated he'd been paying attention to our recent conversations about international expansion. When I offered insights about managing currency risk and cultural adaptation in business development, he took notes and asked follow-up questions that showed he valued my expertise. The contrast with the previous dinner was so complete that Sarah Martinez pulled me aside afterward to comment on the transformation. "It's like watching someone become a completely different person," she said as we stood in my kitchen while I arranged leftover desserts. "6 months ago, he was performing dominance by diminishing you. Tonight, he was performing competence by recognizing your expertise. That's not just a change in behavior. That's a fundamental shift in how he understands relationships and respect. I think he finally learned that you can't build yourself up by tearing other people down," I said. "Especially people who've been supporting you all along. The question," Sarah said carefully, "is whether this change is genuine or whether it's just a reaction to discovering your financial power." It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself as Norman and I worked to rebuild our relationship. Was he treating me with respect now because he recognized my worth as a person, or because he'd learned I had the power to affect his career? The answer I'd come to realize was probably both, and that was acceptable as long as the respect was consistent and genuine, regardless of its original motivation. But the real proof of Norman's transformation came not in our private conversations or family dinners, but in how I watched him interact with other people. The junior associates at Henderson and Associates found themselves receiving the kind of strategic guidance and opportunity creation I'd been providing for him, but with full transparency about where the help was coming from. The administrative staff who'd been invisible to him before suddenly found their insights valued, and their contributions acknowledged. Most tellingly, when he began dating Sarah Martinez seriously, I watched him apply the lessons he'd learned about recognizing and respecting women's intelligence and achievements. Their relationship seemed built on genuine partnership rather than traditional power dynamics, with each of them supporting and challenging the other professionally as well as personally. "You know what I learned from watching you refuse to accept dismissive treatment?" he said to me one evening as the 3 of us worked together on a strategic analysis for a potential new client. "I learned that the most attractive thing about someone isn't their willingness to make you feel important. It's their refusal to make themselves small for your comfort." That observation suggested a level of growth that went far beyond simply learning to treat his mother with respect. Norman had developed the kind of emotional intelligence that would serve him well in all his relationships, professional and personal. The business continued to thrive with my more visible involvement. Board meetings became collaborative sessions where my cross-industry perspective helped shape strategic initiatives that might not have emerged from more traditional planning processes. The relationships I'd been building anonymously for years became open partnerships that allowed for more sophisticated deal-making and more ambitious growth strategies. At 65, I found myself with opportunities I'd never seriously considered during my years of hiding behind VH Holdings. Corporate boards that had previously known me only as a mysterious investor were now inviting me to serve as a director, drawn by the combination of financial expertise and strategic thinking I'd been developing in privacy for years. Professional organizations were requesting me as a speaker at conferences on women in business and late career reinvention. But perhaps the most unexpected development was personal rather than professional. David Pike, a widower and retired technology executive whose company had been part of my investment portfolio for 3 years, had been attending the same industry events where I was now appearing as myself rather than as an anonymous representative of V.H. Holdings. Our conversations about market trends and digital transformation had evolved into dinners that had nothing to do with business, and then into a relationship that reminded me how much of myself I'd been keeping in reserve for years. David was 72, with grown children who lived their own lives and respected his autonomy to build new relationships. He had his own money, his own interests, his own accomplishments, which meant our connection was based on genuine compatibility rather than financial dependence or family obligation. For the first time in decades, I was being valued by someone who saw me clearly, who appreciated my intelligence because he was intelligent enough to recognize it, who respected my achievements because he understood what achieving them had required. Norman's reaction to my relationship with David was perhaps the final test of how much our dynamic had actually changed. The son who had dismissed me as hired help might have been threatened by the idea of his mother having romantic interests, or possessive about sharing my attention, or suspicious about David's motives in pursuing a relationship with a woman of substantial means. Instead, Norman was genuinely pleased to see me happy. He made an effort to get to know David as a person rather than just as his mother's partner, asking thoughtful questions about his technology background, and seeking his advice on digital innovation initiatives at Henderson and Associates. When David began spending time at my house regularly, Norman treated him with the kind of respect he'd learned to show other adults in my life, acknowledging his expertise, valuing his opinions, including him naturally in family gatherings and business conversations. The transformation was complete when Norman and Sarah announced their engagement 18 months after that first disastrous dinner party. The celebration dinner they hosted was everything the earlier evening hadn't been. A gathering where everyone present was treated as a complete person with valuable perspectives, where family relationships enhanced rather than diminished professional conversations, where intelligence was respected regardless of its source. When Norman gave his toast to Sarah, he included a tribute to the relationship that had taught him the most about love and respect. My mother showed me that the most generous thing you can do for someone you love is to see them clearly and respect them completely. It took me too long to learn that lesson, but I'm grateful every day that she was patient enough to keep teaching it until I finally understood. As I sat there listening to my son acknowledge truths it had taken us years to establish, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and battles honorably won. The woman who had been dismissed as hired help had claimed her rightful place, as someone whose intelligence and achievements commanded respect. The mother who had hidden her success to protect her son's confidence had discovered that true generosity required helping him develop the strength to handle difficult truths, rather than shielding him from challenging realities. But perhaps most importantly, the person who had been living as half of herself for so many years had finally integrated all the different aspects of her identity into something coherent and powerful. Victoria Henderson was no longer just Norman's mother or just V.H. Holdings or just David's partner. She was all of these things simultaneously, a woman whose worth couldn't be diminished by anyone's assumptions or limited by anyone's expectations. The story that had started with a shattered champagne glass and a moment of crystalline humiliation had become something much larger. A testament to the possibility of transformation at any age, a reminder that respect must be claimed rather than simply hoped for, and an affirmation that the most authentic relationships are built on truth rather than comfortable fictions. Some stories end with revenge, but the best ones end with transformation. Not just the satisfaction of seeing wrongdoers face consequences, but the deeper pleasure of watching everyone involved become more authentic versions of themselves. The hired help had turned out to be the CEO, but more than that, the mother had turned out to be a whole person worthy of respect, and the son had turned out to be someone capable of learning how to offer it.